I think it's actually pretty much unknown. I mean, the visitors I have come through here and I say, talk about Emory Upton, and I say, well, do you know that statue? And they say, oh, I might know of the statue, but they know nothing about it. And I think that also goes for a lot of residents of Batavia. They go by it every day, but they're not necessarily aware of its importance or what it really means.
I mean, the Upton Monument is I think a dignified and fitting remembrance of the young men who've gone off to war.
I think it really symbolizes the sense of respect that the community has for veterans.
I think it is important that it be there to help remind us that we were involved in those conflicts and that they were meaningful involvements.
I think especially those veterans that might be a little bit older than I am, or their fathers were, or their grandfathers, I think that represents maybe the first contact that they had with actual veterans and what they did.
In 1917, the world was a world in turmoil. War had raged in Europe since 1914. The Germans were sinking U.S. cargo ships. The Russian Revolution was ushering in the world's first socialist government, and socialists were gaining ground in America and other parts of the world, while anarchists worked to disrupt the entire political system. The U.S. was divided over the question of war, and Batavia's citizens were by no means united on these questions. Whether as a point of pride or patriotism, a decades-long effort to build a monument to the community's war dead was gaining momentum. It would culminate in August 1919 with the dedication of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, commonly known as the Upton Monument, at the intersection of Route 5 and Route 63 in the city of Batavia.
First erected on May 1st, 1918, and I find that significant because that was a moment in which the Russian Revolution was in its infancy, and there was concerns in this country regarding radicalism. So there was an overall effort to basically encourage as much patriotism as possible, and I don't think Genesee County was an exception.
Well, the history of the monument really goes back to about a decade after the Civil War. It originally was conceived to be a monument to honor the people from Genesee County who had served in the Civil War.
Really sponsored by the local Civil War veterans groups. That was the first purpose of the monument, was to memorialize and honor veterans of the Civil War.
Finally, about 1903 or 1904, the effort to get a monument built increased in its intensity.
As early as 1903, a committee coordinated a fundraising drive which generated a little less than $2,000, which was given mostly by school children.
The person in that effort was John Kennedy, who was superintendent of schools in Batavia at the time, and after whom Kennedy School was named.
And one of the leaders that was really trying to push for it was actually Emory Upton's sister, Sarah. She was one that put up a decent amount of money to make this happen.
At the start of the 20th century, local economic development was promoted by an organization called the Board of Trade. This appears to have been a private group of local businessmen, but it also served as the forerunner for the Chamber of Commerce and, in a fashion, the Genesee County Economic Development Center. In 1904, a monument maker in Dansville asked the Board of Trade for $10,000 to move his company to Batavia. The Board of Trade offered $4,000, money it eventually raised through donations. That brought C.A. Warden and Warden Monument Works to a new building on Evans Street, a building that would eventually become the home of Doler Jarvis. As Warden Crawford Monument Works, the name of a company after a merger in 1908, and later as Warden Gilboy after another merger, Warden built monuments for distinguished military men and civic leaders in Arlington, Gettysburg, Cleveland, and elsewhere.
A few more years went by. The city government proposed to raise money from taxes to contribute to the construction of the monument. And as that was discussed, eventually it went to a vote by the public and it was rejected.
Controversy, from the evidence that I have been able to look at, is essentially financial in nature. The question was, how much would the city of Batavia pay?
Interesting that, as you say, when the voters had the chance to vote for it, and I think in 1907, I think it was a fairly modest contribution, $5,000 of city money to supplement county money, and they turned it down. I think, Batavians have always been, well, not always been, for the most part, been fiscally conservative and frugal, and maybe there were other factors at work, too, that I don't know about.
In December of 1916, the Upton Post of the Grand Army of the Republic approached the county legislature, which voted to provide some of the funds if the Batavia City Council would provide the balance.
Legislators were persuaded to go ahead and do that, but they didn't want to foot the whole bill, and so they said, we will fund the expense of the monument, providing there's another entity that will make a major contribution. It was pretty clear who they had in mind. They had in mind the then city of Batavia. That at this time there was an event that was taking place, or that had taken place, that was significant to what ensued. At that time, all the sewage in the city came into a facility that was located at the end of the west end of what is now what we refer to as the engine house. On one occasion, the man who was in charge of operating that facility went down to inspect it, and we don't know exactly what happened, but it's surmised that he lit a match and that there was sewer gas and the whole thing exploded, and he died the next day. At the same time in this period, the city obtained its water from the creek at a point that was behind the engine house. So it was decided that what the city needed to do was to not only rebuild the sewage facility, but also to build a new water plant.
But still it takes World War I to really bring it home for everybody.
After hearing from Thomas Ireland of Batavia Monument Works and C.A. Warden of Warden Gilboy, the county's Board of Supervisors voted 4-3 in July of 1917 to accept Warden's proposal for a monument that would be adorned with Lincoln's bust. Edward Pausch would design the monument, Warden said. Pausch was one of the nation's leading sculptors of historic and military figures, and his work is still on display at dozens of historic sites throughout the nation. The granite for the monument would come from Warden's own quarry in Vermont, and Bureau Brothers of Philadelphia, one of the nation's leading foundries for bronze monuments, would bring Pausch's artistic vision to life.
So in 1917, the voters were asked to approve of money for a new sewer facility and a relocated water plant.
The date is not coincidental. That's the date, April 1917, that the U.S. entered the First World War. So there was a good deal of, some might call it patriotism, others might call it jingoistic war hysteria going on then, and I'm sure that contributed to the approval of funds for the monument.
What was effective was the use of the war to essentially suppress any centrist or leftist political ideas, which were quite common in America. The Socialist Party, for example, was I wouldn't say a mainstream party, but the party of Eugene Debs certainly was one that had to be reckoned with by the Democrats and Republicans.
Well, I think there was a lack of interest for at least two reasons. One being so much time had passed. The Civil War by 1900, it is 30 to 40 years in the past. A lot of people probably said, well, we've got other things that are more important. In fact, there were doctors in the community who argued that it was perhaps more important to spend money on a TB hospital here than it was to build monuments.
Well, the default position of Americans used to be, don't get into foreign quarrels. I mean, that was the original advice of George Washington in his farewell address. And U.S. entry into the First World War, man, that was a major departure from American tradition.
In 1877, for an entire year, neither officers nor enlisted men were paid at all. They just received room and board. The basic attitude of the wider society was that the Army was at best an extravagance, and if not a threat to traditional ideals of democracy. And there was, if not outright hostility, there was a pervasive apathy.
And the city kept dragging its heels in terms of spending any money to deal with this sewage issue. Finally, when it came to voters having to approve of building a sewer treatment facility, it barely passed. So now we have a history here of not wanting to spend money, and I think that's part of the larger picture of why people didn't want to spend money on a monument. And
there were mixed feelings. And once the war started, there were really some of the most appalling violations of civil liberties in our country under Woodrow Wilson's Espionage and Sedition Acts. Thousands of Americans were thrown in jail just for saying they were opposed to the war.
So all over the country, we're seeing in 1919 these various monuments that are emerging. I don't think that's a historical coincidence.
During a meeting of the county's Board of Supervisors, where members of the Grand Army of the Republic, Upton Post, made another pitch for a Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Batavia, Bessie Chandler read a poem she wrote for the dedication of a similar monument in Warsaw as a way to encourage supervisors to support the local effort. The poem was subsequently published in the Batavia Daily News.
Monuments by Bessie Chandler. The blue skies bend today o'er fields of plenty. The stars look down on homes of love and peace. The air is full of sounds and scents of summer. The harvest waits, the flocks and herds increase. We listen, but there is no sound of battle. We hark, no roll of drums, no bugle call. We watch and see no smoke of campfires burning, and all our swords hang idle on the wall. Only in city park and country village, all through the land these graven shafts arise, telling the story of our grief and glory, pointing like marble fingers to the skies. Telling the story of those men who left us to walk with death, where battle raged and burned. Telling the story of our loved and loving, who went, so many and so few returned. How must our thoughts go out to love and pity, to those fair southern fields where all alone, deep in their nameless graves, our dead are lying, swept to the end, down paths and ways unknown. And yet today, above us, free, unsullied, flies the same flag for which they gave their all, the flag they followed through the smoke and battle, their glory living, after that their pall. Though links of iron have firmly bound our country, though magic wires her distances have spanned, still that dear blood shed for her preservation is the true bond which strongly holds our land. We stand today in loving contemplation of those who freedom's stormy pathway trod, feeling one pulse, the heartbeat of the patriot, having one flag, one country, and one God.
Having seen that there was not much enthusiasm in the community for funding of a monument, having had it rejected once by voters, I think there was a little clever manipulation on the part of the city leaders at this point, because when they put up the proposal for the money to fund the new water plant and the rebuilt sewer facility, they included a provision of $5,000 for a monument. And I'm kind of guessing that when the voters went to the polls, they kind of overlooked or didn't notice or didn't really care at this point too much about that $5,000. The focus was really on the new water plant and a rebuilt sewer facility.
Whether out of respect for a donation by Sarah Upton Edwards toward a Soldiers and Sailors monument in Batavia, or because of a renewed appreciation of Batavia's most famous military figure, by the time construction began, it was certain the monument would contain a tribute to Upton.
There's no real historic evidence, from what I understand, from what I've read, that General Upton really is even the pattern for the soldier that stands on there. Like you said, if you look underneath it, which a lot of people don't, it says dedicated to the soldiers and sailors of Genesee County from the Civil War. But it's one of those things that gets to be called by whatever it gets to be called by, and neither you nor I nor anybody else is probably going to change people.
It was always officially the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, but because Upton's statue is on the west side, popular reference to it is to call it the Upton Monument, although that's technically not quite what it is. And to make things a little bit more confusing, if you read the inscription on the front of the monument, it says, in memory of soldiers, sailors, and Marines. And that's the first time there's any reference to Marines being involved in any of this discussion, to my knowledge.
While the figure is said to be that of General Emory Upton, there is some controversy about this. Others have long maintained that it resembles him, but really is a symbol of all of the county veterans, at least up until that moment.
The first mention of this happens right after Emory's suicide. So there's also that his memory is still very fresh. So I think it was always supposed to be sort of maybe built around him. Also being the most famous military person from Batavia, it made sense, but there was a reason for him sort of being there's a reason he's the statue.
By the end of the Civil War, Emory Upton was 25 years old and a major general in the U.S. Army. He rose through the ranks by distinguishing himself on the battlefield, both through his bravery and his superior tactics as a commander. It was Upton who, during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, developed a tactic for attacking an entrenched line. The success of Upton's attack led General Ulysses S. Grant to adopt it with significantly more troops 2 days later, leading to a decisive Union victory. After the war, Upton became a West Point instructor, military tactics and history researcher, and author, whose work had a major influence on U.S. Army policy from the start of the 20th century. Plagued by severe headaches, Upton took his own life in San Francisco on March 15, 1881. He was only 42 years old.
It's a reflection of how people think of him, and especially when you go back to the time period he lived in. This was, of course, the moment in which the idea of upward social mobility was really at the forefront of American ideology. So here's basically this farm boy makes it to Major General, and who makes it to West Point as a commandant, who was a published author, who also took positions that were reflective of at least much of Western New York. Of course, he was an abolitionist, and he was very strong in those views. And that kind of religious zeal is also part of the history of Western New York.
He was well known revered might be too strong. It depends probably on who you asked about him. But he was well respected, definitely. And I think it was a point of pride for Batavia. I think everyone took pride in that he was from here. And I think it was sort of appropriate because a lot of his reforms that he tried to push through were to help soldiers and sailors and honor them. And that wasn't something the United States was very good at for a long time.
I think because he was such a multifaceted person, he obviously was a brilliant strategist and tactician who had shown his courage on the battlefield, but he also had this scholarly, thoughtful side to him, as evidenced by his publications, his role as a commandant of cadets at West Point, and because he also, despite his obvious success, met such a tragic end. And I think that resonates with many people.
He writes numerous books on the military history of the United States and of other countries, what they are doing too. He's often put on the same level as Mahan for the Navy in terms of reform.
There was a part of him, I think, that always was seeking a balance between the values of rural life and the wider values of an industrializing America, and an America that had the potential, it wasn't there quite yet in his lifetime, to become a world power, and that poses a great ambivalence, I think, in the minds of someone like Emory Upton, who sees America essentially as this rural agrarian society. I wouldn't go so far as to say he was an isolationist, because he was interested, for example, in armies throughout the world and wrote about them. But he was concerned that the trend of modern America could increasingly take us beyond our borders in ways that were not part of the traditional fabric of this country.
His life ended sadly, as has happened before in our community with prominent figures. Joseph Ellicott apparently committed suicide, and I think the same thing occurred with Upton.
For a long time, I didn't like Upton. I mean, I liked him because he was a Batavian, and that's enough. But the first biography of Upton was by Stephen Ambrose, the famous historian, who after his death, it was revealed that Ambrose had at best fudged facts in his books. At worst, he just outright lied. Anyway, Upton comes off in the Ambrose biography as this humorless martinet, this worshiper of Prussian militarism, who wants to kind of transfer that system from Prussia to America, and we're all going to be regimented and forever at war. And he's reverent toward a professional military, disdainful of volunteer military and of civilian life. And as a result, I sort of imbibed this and had an unfavorable view of Upton. But a couple years ago, this guy David Fitzpatrick published a book, Emory Upton, Misunderstood Reformer, which revised our view of Upton in a much more, to me, favorable way. I mean, obviously, he'd been a Civil War hero. He wrote the book on infantry tactics. He'd written more broadly about the military policy of the United States. He was commandant of cadets at West Point. But there was also a depth and a humanity to him that I think did not come across in previous biographical accounts.
As more than 4 million soldiers were demobilized at the end of World War I, communities across the nation organized Coming Home Days to celebrate the return of their boys. Batavia set its Welcome Home celebration for August 6, 1919. The Batavia Daily News predicted a turnout of 20,000 people. One of the first events of the day was the dedication of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. A brass band from Niagara Falls played patriotic tunes, and General Leroy S. Upton, Emory Upton's nephew, who saw action himself in France, commanding the 9th Infantry to battlefield victories, was the keynote speaker.
I think it definitely plays a central role in how people think about Batavia and their place in it. It's one of those architectural sites that are readily identifiable with a particular area, in this case Batavia. I think in a way that the old courthouse is.
Well, the Upton Monument is at the junction of routes 5 and 63, right at the heart of Batavia, and I think it's at this symbolic center of official Batavia, within this cluster of buildings, the courthouse, the old courthouse, which is now the county building, the Barber Carnival, post office. So in that sense, I think it has tremendous symbolic importance. And I mean, more generally, monuments are tangible, visible, ideally they're aesthetically pleasing reminders to us and instruction in what came before, that we're not the first, we're not just all making this stuff up, but rather we're part of a tradition. And I think they help us understand that we're embedded within a place and within a context, and I think they just add to the richness of our lives and of civic life in general, community life.
It's more like it's a veteran thing, it's a historic thing. It's even, I mean, who of us has not given directions to somebody that are out of town that say, go down Main Street to the Upton Monument and, bear right on Ellicott Street.
I think it's also a memorial to Emory Upton. It's something we have to commemorate him. But it also is just an older piece of architecture on top of that. Even if you take away the symbolic significance, it's actually a beautiful piece of architecture, a piece of art, essentially, that is out for everyone to see.
I mean, there are still traces of Emory Upton in Batavia, not only in the land office with these magnificent displays, but there's an Upton Road west of Batavia. Upton's boyhood home is beautifully maintained by Joan Bird and Bill out there. Also, the supermodel Kate Upton is a descendant of the local branch of the Upton family, and I think if you look really hard at photos of Kate Upton and Emory Upton, there's a real resemblance. They're dead ringers almost.